I was halfway to the conference room door when Serena Vale clicked to slide 1 and started presenting my promotion strategy as if she had personally invented it from scratch. Every line, every chart, every carefully constructed argument I had polished over 6 months of late nights at Norhaven Analytics came out of her mouth, while the senior executives nodded at her like she was the most insightful person in the building. I sat in my chair near the back of the room and kept my expression completely neutral, because the second I showed anything, anger, surprise, recognition, I would be the unstable one and she would be the professional. That is the trap of stolen work in a corporate setting. The person who loses their composure first loses the room. I had figured that out about 30 seconds in, which was 30 seconds faster than it probably should have taken me. The slides were mine. The framework was mine. The client expansion logic I had developed through months of research and informal interviews with the sales team was mine. Serena had reproduced it with enough surface polish to make it look like hers to everyone who had not spent 6 months living inside its construction. The executives kept applauding. Serena kept performing. And I kept sitting there with a smile that took everything I had to maintain, because I had understood something she had not yet figured out. She had stolen the spotlight. She had not stolen the structure. And that difference, invisible now in this room full of impressed people, was going to matter enormously in about 3 weeks. When the meeting ended and people filtered out making congratulatory noises in Serena's direction, I walked back to my desk and opened my project folder. I had suspected something was wrong for about a week, but had been hoping I was reading too much into it. The hoping was over. One of the key draft files I kept in a private subfolder had been accessed at an unusual hour through the internal permission system. The metadata was clear if you knew where to look, which I did because I had started checking after noticing version inconsistencies in my deck earlier that week. The access trail pointed to a team admin account Serena had regular use of. I stared at it for a long moment, then closed the window and sat back. My manager, Colin Marsh, had sent a message during the meeting congratulating the team on Serena's presentation. The framing told me everything about which direction he had already chosen to face. I had 2 options. I could go to HR immediately, where I would be entering a dispute over credit with incomplete documentation against a colleague who had just received a standing ovation from the people making promotion decisions. Or I could wait, document everything carefully, and allow the situation to develop on its own timeline. The situation had a natural timeline built into it. Serena had not just presented my idea, she had accepted the responsibility of executing it. The client expansion project was moving toward a major live presentation in 3 weeks. And the thing about executing someone else's strategy is that you can fake the presentation, but you cannot fake the understanding. Before Serena walked into that conference room with my slides, I had spent 6 months building the client expansion strategy from the ground up. It started with a problem I noticed independently, a structural mismatch in how Norhaven Analytics was approaching mid-market clients in the regional logistics sector. The gap was real, the solution was specific, and the framework I developed addressed it in a way that required understanding both the sales pipeline mechanics and the operational constraints on the client side. I had done informal interviews with 9 members of the sales team without being asked to. I had run my own analysis on 3 years of client retention data. I had drafted, discarded, and redrafted the core framework 4 times before I felt it was genuinely defensible. Nobody had assigned me this project. I had built it because I believed the promotion to strategy lead would go to the person who actually solved a real problem rather than the person who was most visible in the right meetings. That belief now looked like my most expensive professional miscalculation. But I was not willing to let it end there. Serena's version of a strategy was a reproduction of my framework with surface elements rearranged for presentation impact. She had not been through the drafts. She had not tested the failure points. She did not know why certain elements were sequenced the way they were, because she had never had to work through the consequences of sequencing them differently. The skeleton was mine. Her version was a costume. And costumes do not survive direct examination. Serena's interest in my project had materialized out of nothing approximately 6 weeks before the presentation. Before that, she had treated operational strategy work with visible boredom, preferring client-facing visibility and the kind of high-profile meeting attendance that kept her name in front of senior leadership without requiring deep analytical work. Then the promotion rumor solidified. The new strategy lead role would come from our division. The timeline was specific, and suddenly Serena became intensely curious about the project she had previously ignored completely. She asked for collaboration meetings. She wanted to see draft decks for alignment purposes. She dropped by my desk with questions framed as intellectual interest that I now recognized as data collection. I had answered too openly because I assumed curiosity meant support. Within 3 weeks of her sudden interest, my private draft folder had been accessed without my knowledge. Version histories had been tampered with in small ways that would have been invisible if I had not been monitoring carefully, and a talking point section I had kept entirely off shared drives appeared in Serena's first internal run-through in language close enough to mine to leave no doubt about the source. I documented all of it without saying anything. I had decided by that point that Serena did not understand what she had taken well enough to defend it under real scrutiny. The most efficient response was to let the real pressure arrive on its own schedule. About a week before Serena's big presentation, I went back through my files and found version inconsistencies that looked small until I checked the metadata. A draft I had saved under a specific name had been opened from an IP address that was not mine, at a time I was not in the office. 2 note sections had been moved in ways I had not authorized, and a talking point document I stored locally had somehow appeared in a shared folder under a directory path that connected to a team admin profile. I printed the metadata records and added them to a folder I was building with the same discipline I applied to everything else. Access trail, timestamps, version histories, comparative analysis between my original documents and Serena's presentation, as I had been able to reconstruct it from the slides she had used. None of this was for HR yet. HR would come later if it came at all. What I needed first was contrast, a clear documented gap between what I had built and what she was now performing. The more Serena changed the framework to put her signature on it, the more that gap grew. She was editing the strategy to look like hers, which meant she was editing out exactly the structural choices that made it work. Every modification she made to the core framework for aesthetic or presentational reasons was a modification that moved her version further from the underlying logic and closer to a collapse point she did not know was coming. I stopped thinking of the presentation as something that had been stolen from me and started thinking of it as a deadline she did not understand she was working against. Colin Marsh told me in a brief, careful conversation that Serena would be leading client-facing execution on the strategy project going forward, and that my role would be to provide internal support. He framed it as operational efficiency, said it would allow me to focus on back-end quality control, and used enough neutral professional language that the conversation technically contained nothing I could quote as evidence of anything. But what it communicated was clear enough. The decision about who owned this project had been made by someone above him, probably by someone who had watched Serena's presentation and drawn the straightforward conclusion that she was the visible author. Colin was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had decided that the path of least institutional resistance ran through Serena's momentum rather than through a messy credit dispute with someone who had not yet spoken up. I did not argue with him. I agreed to the support role in writing, using language that would later clarify exactly who had been providing the substantive analysis at every stage. I also asked Colin, in the same email, to copy me on all client communications so I could ensure continuity in the technical details. He agreed without thinking carefully about what that meant. It meant I would have a documented record of every question asked, every answer given, and every moment Serena's performance diverged from the structural understanding I had built. 3 weeks to the live client presentation. I started counting. Serena had taken one critical element of my strategy and treated it as decorative. The risk-balancing model at the center of the expansion framework was not a visual aid. It was functional architecture. It governed how certain client segments would be prioritized during a staged rollout, and the sequencing was determined by failure point analysis I had run across 3 years of company data. To someone reading the slides without understanding the methodology, it looked like a clean, simple graphic. To Serena, apparently, it had looked like something she could simplify for presentation impact. She had removed one safeguard layer that existed specifically to catch a category of client churn that spiked in the second phase of any major rollout. She had replaced it with a forward-projecting metric that made the timeline look faster and the numbers look more impressive. The metric was completely valid in isolation. In context, it was a trap. It prioritized short-term acquisition numbers in a way that would create a visible success followed by a preventable collapse if the churn safeguard was not active during the transition window. I knew this because I had made the same mistake in my third draft and spent 2 weeks correcting it. Serena had made it because she did not know why the safeguard was there. She thought it was redundant caution. It was not. The live client presentation was now less than 3 weeks away, and the client's general counsel, a sharp woman named Mira Denholm, had already requested a session focused on functional mechanics rather than polished slides. That request had made Serena visibly uncomfortable. It had made me feel something very close to come. I congratulated Serena in writing after her presentation, copying Colin, and offered my ongoing support in terms so professionally warm that nobody reading the email could have inferred anything but sincere collaborative goodwill. It was not dishonest. I was genuinely willing to support the project because innocent people's work would be affected if the strategy collapsed badly. But it was strategic. Serena read my congratulations as surrender. She stopped being careful about what she said around me. She started referring to my original framework elements as things she had developed, stopped citing any collaborative context, and began treating my questions and contributions as minor technical assistance from someone who had accepted their secondary role. That lowered her guard in exactly the way I needed, because once she stopped managing how she appeared to me, she started making mistakes in my presence without calculating how those mistakes would read in a documented record. She forwarded one of my original analytical notes back to me as if it were her own summary, apparently having forgotten or never noticed that the note was mine. She contradicted in a cross-functional planning call a structural choice I had made, and then 4 days later used the original version without acknowledging she had reversed herself. Each moment was dated and added to the folder. The folder was now very thick and very organized, and the live client presentation was in 10 days. I had been watching Serena try to explain the strategy in real-time discussions for 2 weeks, and the pattern was consistent. She understood the language of my framework well enough to present it in prepared settings where she controlled the sequence of information. She did not understand the logic well enough to answer unscripted questions about why specific choices had been made. At a cross-functional preparation call, she was asked why the client tier sequencing started with segment B rather than segment A given segment A's higher revenue potential. The real answer required understanding the churn pattern data I had analyzed across 3 years of company history. Serena answered with language about strategic prioritization and phased optimization that sounded fluent and meant essentially nothing. 2 analysts on the call exchanged a look. I did not comment. After the call, one of them messaged me privately asking whether I had actually built the framework. I told her to save her meeting notes. Then I told her one more thing. If she had access to the early draft history in the shared project archive, she should familiarize herself with the version timeline before the live presentation. She asked why. I told her the client's general counsel had specifically requested functional detail, and that context would be useful for the whole team. She understood what I was suggesting. She was smarter than either Colin or Serena had noticed. I started saving everything with the systematic focus of someone who understands that documentation is not paranoia. It is the only currency that survives institutional memory loss. I exported version histories from every draft file. I archived email threads chronologically. I saved the metadata records showing access patterns. I created a comparison document laying my original drafts against Serena's presentation version with annotations showing where the framework had been altered and what the functional consequences of each alteration were. The comparison document alone ran to 14 pages. I formatted it clearly, dated each entry, and stored copies in 3 separate locations. At the same time I was collecting a different kind of record. The documented evidence of questions Serena could not answer, contradictions between her stated ownership and her actual understanding, and every moment where a client or team member had directed a technical question to me rather than to her because something in the conversation had redirected their instinct. Mina, an analyst who had helped me test early versions of the framework, had told me she had seen Serena searching through shared drives weeks before the big presentation, accessing directories that were not relevant to any project she was officially working on. Mina still had the chat log of a conversation in which Serena had asked her where my latest draft was stored and whether old versions were tracked. That conversation predated the presentation by 5 weeks. Combined with the metadata trail from my own files, it established intent in a way that HR's definition of complex attribution dispute would have difficulty surviving. Colin asked me to support Serena behind the scenes for the good of the team, and I agreed in the measured way I had been agreeing to everything since the presentation, by email with specific language, copying the relevant parties. The cooperation I gave was real but calibrated. I answered direct questions about structural details when asked. I corrected technical errors that would have created problems visible enough to damage the project outcome. And I let every request, every clarification, every correction flow through written communication that established a clear record of who had the understanding and who was seeking it. Serena was operating in full confidence that my cooperation meant she had managed the situation successfully. What she had actually done was create a timeline showing with increasing clarity the direction that knowledge flowed between us. Every technical correction request she sent me was a data point. Every time she incorporated my response without attribution was another. Every meeting where she arrived with my analysis in her mouth and no ability to defend it when questioned was another layer in a record that now had its own momentum. The live presentation was in 4 days. Mira Denholm's office had confirmed the client's board would be present. Colin had told me I would be in the room but off camera, which was his way of keeping me available without restoring my visibility. I accepted that arrangement without argument. Off camera was fine. Off camera meant I could watch everything. Mina came to me 3 days before the presentation and told me she had been thinking about what I said about context and version history. She had gone back through the project archive herself and found something she thought I should know about. She had a set of chat logs showing Serena not only asking where my drafts were stored but also asking whether the revision tracking on those drafts could be disabled for a cleaning process she described as routine file maintenance. The request had gone to a team admin contact who had not processed it, apparently because it looked unusual. Mina had the full exchange. She had kept it because it struck her at the time as strange, and she had a habit of saving things that felt strange. She was willing to help me, but needed to know she would not become the person the organization targeted once things became uncomfortable. I told her the truth. She would not be the target if the evidence was clean and the timing was right. She had the chat logs. I had the metadata trail, the version comparisons, and 14 pages of documented framework alterations. Together we had something that HR's definition of complex attribution dispute could not outlast. I told Mina to send me a copy of the logs and hold everything else until after the presentation. Then I told her the most important thing: make sure she was on the broadcast feed for the live session. She asked why. I told her the client's board would be in the room and the general counsel had specifically asked for functional depth. I said she might want to be watching when Mira Denholm asked her first unscripted technical question. The live client presentation was scheduled for a Thursday morning, broadcast across all regional offices with the client's executive board and senior leadership present in the room. Serena had spent the preceding week preparing with the focused energy of someone who believed the moment was going to cement her promotion. She rehearsed. She polished slides. She had coffee with Colin. She performed confidence in every setting that contained someone who would be making decisions about her career. What she did not do was go back to the underlying data and rebuild her understanding of the structural logic. She knew the framework as a sequence of talking points. She knew it well enough to present it in a linear flow. She had no ability to navigate outside the scripted path because she had never built the map. She had only memorized the route. I arrived early, set up at a side table with my notes, and watched her coming glowing with the particular radiance of someone who thinks they are 30 minutes away from the biggest win of their professional life. She looked at me briefly, gave a small nod that communicated more dismissal than acknowledgement, and turned toward the executives. 2 minutes into her opening remarks, she made a claim about projected client acquisition velocity in the second quarter that the live data feed running on the room's secondary display could not support. The number she cited was from a version of the model she had edited before I had corrected it. Nobody caught it immediately, but I caught it, and I wrote down the timestamp. The session ran for 90 minutes, and the first 30 went well enough for Serena. She moved through the prepared material with visible confidence, used my language cleanly, and handled the early questions from the client's operational team with the kind of prepared answer that sounds like genuine expertise if no one pushes deeper. Then Mira Denholm started pushing deeper. Myra's first real question was about the risk containment logic in the second phase of the rollout. She wanted to understand the specific trigger conditions for the churn safeguard. Serena smiled and gave an answer about proactive monitoring and dynamic adjustment that used impressive-sounding language without answering the question. Mira asked again more specifically. Serena pivoted to the acquisition metric she had replaced the safeguard with and explained its advantages. Mira waited for her to finish, then said she understood the metric but wanted to know about the safeguard, specifically why it had been removed from the current version when it had appeared in the preliminary framework the client had reviewed previously. The room went quiet. Serena had not known the client had seen a previous version with my original safeguard intact. She did not know because she had not been involved in the preliminary review. I had conducted it before she took over the project. She turned toward me off camera, and the microphone near her presentation podium was still active. What she said next was heard by every person in the room and every regional office watching the broadcast. She said, loudly enough to be unmistakable, "Fix this." The two words traveled into the room and across the broadcast feed and immediately changed the nature of every conversation happening around the table. The client's board members looked at each other. The executives from Norhaven looked at the screen and then at Colin, who had gone very still in his seat near the wall. Serena realized what had happened approximately 2 seconds after it happened, which was 2 seconds too late. I stepped forward with exactly the calm I had been saving for this moment and addressed Myra's question directly. I walked through the safeguard logic, explained the churn pattern data that had informed its placement, identified the alteration Serena had made to the framework and the risk it created in the second rollout phase, and offered a concrete path forward using the original structure. I did all of this in the measured technical voice of someone who had spent 6 months living inside the construction of every sentence I was saying. Then one of the client board members asked whether I had drafted the original decision logic. Before Serena could intercept the question, I answered that yes, the framework had been developed under my authorship. I referenced the preliminary framework the client had seen, the one that still carried my structural choices because it predated Serena's modifications. I did not accuse anyone of anything in that room. I simply answered the question accurately and let the draft history do the rest of the work it had been waiting patiently to do. Mina sent the chat logs to the senior vice president during the presentation. She had been watching on the broadcast feed and had made the decision without waiting to discuss it with me first, which I think was exactly right. By the time the session ended, the VP had a message from Mina, a recorded broadcast showing Serena's whispered request, a client request to understand the authorship of the framework they had been sold, and a room full of executives who had watched the gap between performance and understanding open live in front of them. Colin looked like a man calculating how much of this he could survive depending on which direction he turned next. Serena had stopped performing and gone very quiet, which told me she had finally understood the shape of what had happened. The VP asked to speak with me privately after the session. She was composed and direct, and did not waste time with softening language. She asked me to walk her through the authorship timeline of the strategy framework. I did, with documentation. I had brought the folder, every version, every date, every metadata record, every structural choice and the draft in which it first appeared, the comparison between my original framework and Serena's modified presentation version, Mina's chat logs, the access trail for my private files. I laid it out in order, without drama and without anger, because I had learned over 6 months of preparation that calm precision is the most powerful thing you can carry into a room. HR found its spine quickly once the VP was involved, because institutional cowardice has a very specific relationship with institutional embarrassment, and what the broadcast feed had preserved was the latter in a form nobody could rewrite. Within 24 hours, interviews were scheduled. Access logs were formally requested. Mina's chat logs became part of an official review. Serena was placed on administrative review, pending investigation. Colin was asked not to contact team members directly while the process was active, which was a careful institutional way of acknowledging that his role in enabling the situation needed to be examined separately from Serena's role in creating it. I cooperated with the review fully and provided every piece of documentation I had assembled in order with dates and source annotations. The review moved faster than these things usually move, partly because the broadcast evidence was unambiguous, and partly because the client's board had expressed concern about the authorship question in a way that converted an internal credit dispute into a business relationship risk. At the end of the review period, the investigative finding was that the core strategy framework had been developed under my authorship, that access to my draft materials had occurred without authorization, and that the presentation of that material as original work by another individual represented a serious breach of professional conduct standards. The finding used careful, specific language. It said exactly what had happened without saying more than could be precisely documented. It was exactly the finding I had built my folder to produce. The VP called me in after the review concluded and told me something I had wanted to hear for a long time, delivered in the flat professional tone of someone who was also managing an institutional problem and a client relationship simultaneously. She said leadership had identified two failures: Serena's conduct and the organization's willingness to reward visible performance over documented substance. She asked whether I still wanted the strategy lead role. I had imagined being asked that question for months, but when it arrived I felt something steadier than excitement, something more like the specific satisfaction of a person who knows the ground beneath them is solid for the first time in a while. I said yes. I said yes on one condition: that attribution be clearly established in the official project record, and that authorship protection be written into my transition agreement. She agreed immediately, which told me how badly the firm needed this resolved cleanly. Serena's demotion was handled the following week, removed from client-facing leadership, stripped of the strategy project, reassigned to a role with no connection to the work she had tried to claim. Colin was quietly moved to a different team structure. Mina received a formal commendation for her role in preserving project integrity, which was the institution's way of acknowledging that the outcome had depended on someone being willing to send a message during a live broadcast. I started in the strategy lead role 2 weeks later with my name attached to the framework in every client-facing document. The official outcome was clear enough. Serena was demoted. Colin was reassigned. I was named strategy lead with formal authorship recognition across the project record. The company issued updated internal credit and attribution protocols, the kind of policy update that only happens when public embarrassment has been thorough enough to make insurance against repetition feel necessary. For a few days after the announcement, the office operated in the slightly charged atmosphere that follows an institutional reckoning, where everyone is being very careful and somewhat more thoughtful than usual about what they say to whom. People who had not looked at me closely during the previous months suddenly wanted brief, warm conversations. I was polite to all of them. What struck me most in the aftermath was not the professional restoration, though that was real and meaningful, but the particular clarity that came from having done everything the right way for the right reasons. I had not gone to HR with incomplete evidence and emotion. I had not confronted Serena in a way that would have made me the problem. I had not vented to colleagues in ways that could have been turned against me. I had documented, waited, and let the situation develop to the point where the truth had no cover left. That kind of patience is genuinely difficult when you are watching your work attributed to someone else in a conference room full of executives. But patience and documentation, working together, produce something that anger and immediate confrontation almost never can, an outcome the institution has to formally acknowledge. About 3 weeks after I formally took the strategy lead role, Lena, another analyst who had worked on a previous project, knocked on my office door with an expression I recognized. She had the look of someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally decided to set it down. She described a situation from 18 months earlier in which a project she had led independently had been repositioned during a critical client pitch as a partner-guided initiative with her contribution framed as execution support rather than authorship. The documentation trail in that case was less organized than mine. She had not known to preserve things the way I had, but what she had was enough to establish a pattern. The same method, the same reframing of visible success as belonging to the person with the higher title, the same erasure of the person who had actually built the thing. I told her to compile what she had and bring it to the VP directly, not to HR, not to Colin's replacement, but to the person who now had direct context about how this pattern operated and why it mattered to the institution's client relationships. The VP was not surprised by Lena's account. She said 3 words that told me the firm had been managing this awareness for some time without acting on it fully. I know. Thank you. The pattern was bigger than my case. My case had been the one that finally made the institution confront it in a format it could not redirect. The thing Serena had never understood, and the thing Colin had also failed to fully account for, was that institutional reputation flows in the direction of documented substance once performance without substance fails publicly. For months, the appearance of visible success had been enough to maintain the illusion. The moment that illusion collapsed in front of a live client audience, everything that had been accumulating in the folder I had been building reoriented from background evidence to central record. People who had been cheerfully uncertain about who had actually built the strategy were suddenly very certain. Not because I had told them, I had said remarkably little directly, but because the broadcast had made visible something everyone in the organization could now interpret through their own direct experience of having watched it happen. The executives who had nodded approvingly at Serena's presentation and given me vague sympathetic looks when I was sidelined were now nodding approvingly in my direction and giving Serena careful minimal professional courtesy. That is how institutional credibility works when it redistributes, not all at once, but in the specific gravity of many small redirections happening simultaneously. I was aware enough of how offices work to understand that this new alignment of attention was itself a resource with a limited shelf life. It would not sustain itself automatically. What would sustain it was the work, the actual strategy, executed correctly, producing real results for real clients in the way the framework had been designed to produce them. I got to work on that immediately. Recruiting contacts reached out within a month of the announcement, which told me the industry conversation had moved faster than internal communications usually do. 2 firms expressed interest in having me lead strategy teams at the associate director level. One offered a conversation about building a practice from the ground up. I took all 3 meetings, not because I had decided to leave North Haven immediately, but because I wanted to understand what my value looked like from outside the institution that had spent 6 months erasing it. What those conversations confirmed was something I already suspected. The strategy framework I had built for the client expansion project had become known in the relevant industry circles, and the story of its authorship had traveled with it. Credit, once it is properly attached, is remarkably adhesive. Serena's name was not the one being discussed in those conversations. Mine was. I returned to North Haven with a clearer sense of what I was worth and what I was willing to accept as terms for contributing that worth to any institution going forward. I told the VP after my last external meeting that I had received offers and had decided to stay, contingent on a specific set of professional commitments. She did not negotiate against any of them. That willingness to accept my terms without friction told me more about how seriously the firm now regarded the risk of losing me than any formal offer letter could have. I had started this whole period as someone being systematically erased. I was ending it as someone the institution was actively working to retain. 3 months after the presentation, I ran into Serena at a company event. She had been reassigned to a project management role with no client-facing or strategic component, which was the institutional equivalent of being filed away somewhere quiet. She looked fine, in the specific way people look fine when they have decided to perform normalcy as a professional strategy. I was cordial. I did not gloat, not because I was above it, but because I understood that the outcome had already said everything that needed to be said, and that adding anything personal on top of it would only reduce its clarity. She said something brief about hoping things worked out with the new role. I said I appreciated it. That was the whole conversation. What I carried away from it was not satisfaction exactly, more like the recognition of a closed chapter. Serena had made a calculated bet that polish theft would outlast scrutiny. It had not. The bet had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the strategy framework actually was, not just a presentation, but a system with structural requirements that required real understanding to sustain. She had taken the visible surface and left behind the invisible architecture. The architecture had eventually made the surface unsustainable. The lesson in that is not specific to any single workplace or any single act of professional dishonesty. It applies anywhere people try to operate at a level above their genuine understanding by borrowing someone else's foundation. The foundation is always the thing that tells the truth in the end. The revised project, running now under my direct leadership with the original safeguard restored and the churn model recalibrated to the correct sequencing, began producing results in the second quarter that matched my original projections closely. Mira Denholm's team confirmed early adoption metrics that the modified version would not have been able to sustain through the second phase. The board members who had been present at the live session took note in a way that produced direct client communication, crediting the strategic framework explicitly and by name. Within 6 months, the client expansion work had generated enough documented success to become a reference case for the firm's business development materials. My name was attached to it in every version. Colin's replacement, a director named Priya, ran team meetings in a way that made individual contribution visible rather than routinely redirecting credit upward. I found that working environment almost disorienting at first, not because credit attribution should have been unusual, but because I had spent long enough in the previous dynamic that its absence felt strange. I adjusted. The adjustment was not difficult. It turns out that working in an environment where documented substance is genuinely valued is exactly as good as you imagine it will be when you are sitting in a room watching your work attributed to someone else. Lena eventually received formal recognition for the earlier project through the review the VP had quietly initiated after their conversation. It was not complete correction of what had been done to her, but it was acknowledgement. In institutional terms, acknowledgement is sometimes the closest thing to justice that the system produces. The credit attribution protocol that Noor Haven issued after the investigation became, within 6 months, a model that was referenced in an industry publication covering professional ethics in strategy consulting. It required explicit documentation of analytical authorship in all client-facing materials, specific attribution and version histories of major project files, and formal review procedures for situations where authorship was disputed during a project's development. It was not a perfect policy. No policy written in response to a specific embarrassment ever is. But it was a policy, which meant the behavior that had produced the embarrassment was now formally prohibited and documentable if it recurred. I was invited to contribute to the policy's development, which I did with the same calm precision I had brought to everything else. I made one specific request, that the attribution requirements apply retroactively to currently active major projects, not just new ones going forward. The request was granted. 3 associates on existing projects requested formal documentation reviews within the first month of the policy's implementation. In 2 of those cases, attribution was corrected. I do not know the details of those cases. I do not need to. What I know is that the situation I had experienced and documented had produced, as one of its downstream effects, a structural change that made it harder for the next person in my position to face the same outcome without having recourse earlier in the process. That is not nothing. In fact, across the several things that had come out of an experience I would not have chosen, that one feels most like something worth having built. A year after the live presentation that had changed everything, Noor Haven promoted me to strategy director with client leadership authority and a team of 5. The announcement was formal, attributed, and specific in a way that the firm's previous promotion communications had not always been. My name was attached to the client expansion work that had driven significant revenue growth. My methodology was cited in the promotion rationale. The process felt almost ceremonially opposite to the experience of sitting in a conference room watching my work come out of someone else's mouth. I had a brief private moment with that comparison before the professional obligations of the day took over completely. The promotion was real. The work was mine. The folder was archived in a location I maintained access to indefinitely. The lesson I carried from the whole experience was not primarily about corporate politics or credit disputes or even professional strategy. It was about the relationship between discipline and outcome in environments where both are tested at the same time. Keeping the folder had required discipline. Waiting for the right moment had required discipline. Maintaining composure through months of watching someone else credited for my work had required a kind of discipline that does not have a glamorous name. But it had produced the outcome that no amount of immediate confrontation would have reached: a clean, documented, institutionally acknowledged truth that could not be argued around because I had never given it a reason to be questioned. 2 years later, Serena left the firm. The reassignment she had received after the demotion had never provided the kind of visibility she needed to rebuild toward her previous standing, and without that visibility, the professional identity she had constructed at Noor Haven had no foundation to stand on. I heard about her departure through a mutual contact and felt nothing particular about it. Not satisfaction, not regret, just the mild recognition of an inevitable outcome completing itself. Mina had been promoted the previous quarter to a senior analyst role with expanded project authority. Her willingness to send those chat logs during the live broadcast had been formally recognized and had become part of how her contribution to the firm was described in internal performance reviews. She had told me shortly after the review, concluded that she had been afraid to act until the moment she understood that waiting longer would make the action meaningless. That instinct, to act at the moment when action is most useful rather than most comfortable, struck me as the thing most worth keeping from the whole experience. I had operated on a version of the same instinct throughout the preceding months. Not rushing to act when evidence was incomplete. Not waiting so long that the moment passed. Finding the specific interval where patience and timing met and produced something that speed alone or delay alone would not have created. In offices full of people performing confidence and managing optics, that interval is available to anyone disciplined enough to wait for it and prepared enough to use it. The executive who had quietly flagged my strategy work as leadership track material months before Serena's presentation turned out to be a VP from the client development side whose involvement I had not known about during the project. She mentioned it in a conversation after my promotion, describing how she had reviewed the preliminary framework I had shared with Myra's team before Serena took over the project and had noted in internal discussions that whoever had built that framework was someone the firm should be investing in specifically. That observation had apparently been made, noted, and then quietly buried when Serena's presentation landed and the narrative momentum moved in a different direction. The same observation had resurfaced after the broadcast, combined with Mina's chat logs and my documentation, and had contributed to the speed and specificity of the VP's initial response. I sat with that information for a while after our conversation. It told me something useful about how institutions actually work versus how they present themselves as working. A senior person had identified the right answer, and the system had initially routed around it because visible performance created institutional momentum that documentation, sitting in a folder, could not immediately counter. The live presentation had not changed the facts. It had changed the cost of ignoring the facts. Sometimes that is what has to happen, not for the truth to become known, because the people with the authority to act often already know it, but for the cost of acting on it to finally exceed the cost of continuing to ignore it. I kept one thing from the folder after I archived it. A single printed page, the original first draft of the strategy framework, dated with the date I had started the project, with my name in the document metadata, and a brief annotation in my own handwriting at the bottom that said simply, "Built this from scratch, this is what it is." I had written that annotation late on a Tuesday night about 4 months into the project, when I was tired and the promotion felt genuinely close, and I was still operating under the assumption that good work recognized itself. The annotation was not meant for anyone else to read. It was a private note from me to me, the kind of thing people write when they want to mark a moment of genuine effort and feel certain enough in it to say it plainly. I kept that page because it was the cleanest record of what the whole experience had cost and what it had produced. It had cost me months of watching my work attributed to someone else and months of managing the discipline required to respond to that correctly. What it had produced was a professional record that was completely, documentably mine, an institutional outcome that had formally acknowledged it, and a very specific understanding of what it means to build something carefully enough that the truth about its authorship cannot be permanently suppressed, only temporarily inconvenient. The page sits in a file in my home office. I look at it occasionally. Sometimes it is useful to remember what you built before anyone decided to tell you whether you were allowed to own it. 3 weeks after my promotion to strategy director, Lena told me she had found another old file, a previous matter in which a junior analyst's work had been repositioned as manager-supervised output during a critical client pitch. The analyst involved had left the firm 2 years earlier. Lena did not know whether that departure had been connected to the attribution situation or was simply coincidental timing. The file had been flagged for review by the firm's internal audit team. I did not know how that review would end or what, if anything, could be corrected for someone who was no longer at the company. But I knew the file now existed in a system that was formally required to examine it. That was different from the situation that had existed before. I thought about that for a while, about how long the pattern had apparently operated, about how many people had moved through institutional environments carrying the specific exhaustion of work that was taken without acknowledgement, about how rarely those situations resolve in ways that feel complete. Then I went back to work. The strategy project had a second phase deadline in 6 weeks. The safeguard layer was fully restored. The churn model was calibrated correctly. The client was satisfied, and my name was on every document that described it.